everyone. Thank you for joining us. Let me introduce Chris Howard. Chris is one of the visionaries of the open source ideology. Chris, as all we know that open source ideology for the last 20 years has been extensively developed, and nowadays even companies which were skeptical about it currently starts to support it. So what has been changed during such like last 2 decades about the open source?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. I think we've seen more and more enterprises really kind of taking advantage of the benefits of collaborative innovation. And we only need to look at what's happened in the last kind of 5-10 years in terms of the emergence of industries like fintech, health tech, and now we're talking about the metaverse. And open source, I think, really is a methodology that just brings together diverse thought and ideas from all over the world outside of those boundaries of a traditional enterprise, which is why we're seeing so many CTOs, CIOs really jumping onto this as being part of their strategic kind of roadmap and saying, actually, we need to be investing in open source. We need to be contributing back to open source. And really, this is the future, certainly in my opinion, of the digital world that we're moving into.
Thank you. So currently, as far as we all see that even such big companies as Microsoft moving all their main assets into the open source, and Chris will tell us a little bit more in details about the future of this ideology and how it will actually change the surface and evolution of the IT development in nearest years.
Absolutely. Great. Well, we'll kick off, and thanks so much for the introduction. And it's a real privilege to be here today, speaking to you all as part of this EngX conference. I hope you've been having a good morning so far, and I'm really excited to be able to get stuck into this topic around open source, primarily targeted towards the audience today, so engineering and others, how we can get started in open source, how you might get better at that, but also then once you kind of establish yourself, how do we get recognized? What other things can we be doing to build our kind of reputation in this space? So as you heard before, my name is Chris Howard. I lead the open source program office here at EPAM. And it's really important to call out, actually, I'm not an engineer. So I'm going to be talking to you from the perspective of running the program office and really amalgamating and bringing together best practice advice and kind of insights that we've gained from working not just with our clients, but also other open source functions all over the world. And I'm really thankful as well. I must display some gratitude now to a whole range of EPAM developers who contributed to this presentation in terms of providing best practice and ideas that they felt were really worth sharing to the wider engineering community. So yeah, it's a real privilege to be here. You can see my handles at the bottom, GitHub and Twitter. Throughout the presentation or indeed afterwards, feel free to reach out to me if you've got other questions or you want to follow up on something. And on the left there, you can see that picture. This was a few weeks ago. I was actually talking at the Open Source Strategy Forum, and we were actually, just to go back to what we were saying at the beginning, talking about how can we get more and more banks and financial services companies to really embrace what is a regulated industry, to really embrace open source and take inside those organizations the benefits that we can see from open collaboration. So it's something we're really excited about. EPAM is really committed to this, and we'll hear a bit more about that in a few minutes. But yeah, it's a real privilege to be here. So it's always useful, and I'm sure many of you know, but it's always useful to set the scene. So what is open source? Some of you might be totally unaware of this. I'm sure the majority of you, given the extent that it reaches out to our engineering lives, are aware of it. But open source really is kind of publicly accessible code, tools, solutions, frameworks, accelerators, models that's available for individuals and organizations to modify, distribute, even sell. They can even take that code and decide to sell that out as a commercial entity or a revenue stream. But what's important here is that that's all subject to license conditions. And I know that sounds scary and many people think, oh gosh, open source, legal, governance, etc. And it really shouldn't be the case. We're not going to talk about the scope of licensing and benefits necessarily today, but open source really relies upon, as I said before, this collaborative way of working and this kind of decentralized approach to software development. And it really has become a movement that goes beyond kind of traditional software engineering. It's about reaching outside of our perhaps siloed teams and bringing in expertise, not just from perhaps within the business, but also all over the world and leveraging people's capabilities. And it really enables us to find, both as enterprises, but also as individuals, also as developers yourselves, to kind of find new and innovative ways to solve problems, leveraging the community, but also working with industries, non-profits, suppliers, clients. And we've got some slides later on talking about the industry and some of the bodies that exist to help with open source being championed. And it's therefore probably no surprise that 97% of businesses are using some form of open source all over the world. And there's loads of reports out there that provide a lot more context on this and more data. So if that's something you're interested in, feel free to reach out and I can definitely provide you some kind of collateral around that. And of course, open source has some real key benefits. And again, we won't go into those, but I think 20 years ago, to go back to that question, we might have been talking about open source being kind of free software, cost beneficial, etc. I think that's shifted now, and organizations are instead talking about the innovation, the battle testing of software, the ability to get external eyes on code and security enhancements as a result of that. So there's a bit of real shift in terms of the motivations behind embracing open source. So you're probably wondering, okay, this all sounds great, and Chris is here talking to us from EPAM. So how does this all fit into EPAM? Well, EPAM is absolutely committed to open source, both in supporting our clients in their consumption, upstream contribution and maturity of open source, but also ensuring, most importantly, that our engineers and colleagues within the business are empowered to engage with open source on a daily basis in the work that they're delivering, or indeed perhaps the learning and development that they're engaged in. And we have over 150,000 commits in the public domain in the open source space. And we've got nearly 100 solutions that we've built and born within EPAM. So development teams have been working on with clients, or perhaps in our garage and our lab. And we've decided that these are more beneficial for the world. So we've released these solutions out to our kind of GitHub, as well as many other repositories and contributions to other non-profits. And really, we've got thousands of open source contributors across the organization pushing forward not just our own reputation, but also giving back to the world. So we really are behind this. And in the last few months, we've been engaged in things like the Global Open Source Strategy Forum, the OSPO conference, Open Source Summit, and indeed a few weeks ago we were at COP26 as well, listening to the future of open source in the context of sustainability and how perhaps there's some benefits through kind of carbon offsetting and good kind of software engineering being responsible for the environment. So we really do believe that open source is a driver for the digital world and is moving forward as an enabler of innovation and collaboration, something we're very passionate about. And so much so, we built something called the Open Source Contributors Index. We maintain this project going forward, and we're always looking for further collaborators on this. But it's an index that measures global contributions from corporations all over the world. And at the top, we've got some big names like Microsoft, Google. EPAM has very proudly always been in the top 20. And then we also measure 300 plus organizations on their kind of community size and contributions. And we've got some great new release coming up for that in the new year. So hopefully that kind of reinforces why I'm speaking to you today and why EPAM really is committed to open source. This is a real driver for us, and we're really excited to have this opportunity to share. You might be saying, great, well, this all sounds good, but typically, and I'm exactly the same as you, what's in it for me? What do I get out of this as an individual? So I've borrowed a quote here. Contributing to open source for you and as an individual can be a rewarding way to learn, teach, and build experience in just about any skill you can imagine. So the next 4 slides, before we get stuck into the getting started, really just call out, which I think is important, what you can potentially expect to receive as a result of engaging in open source. And the first one, probably no surprise, is the opportunity to improve that software that you're perhaps working with on a daily basis. And I'm absolutely certain that the majority of us listening today will come across code bases or source code that we're working with, and we think, oh, it'd be great if we could refactor that, or perhaps there's a defect here that I've seen, or I'm not quite sure how this works this way. What about trying it another way? And really being wishful that you could perhaps make those changes. Well, open source enables that. It enables you to say, okay, this isn't quite right, or I think we could do this better, because we've got some excellent engineers amongst us. It gives you that opportunity to post that code back upstream and say to those maintainers of that source code, perhaps this might be a better way to do it. Or I've noticed that every time I run this query, I get this error. So perhaps we could debug it in this manner. So the benefit immediately from you is that you're not just helping yourself, your day-to-day work by improving the software that you're engaging with, but you're also helping your peers, you're helping the people that will come after you, and indeed you're giving back to the community, which is a key element of open source. But secondly, there's a real opportunity here to improve skills. And I always call this out because I think this is really important. Open source doesn't just provide you the opportunity to kind of harness and really improve your coding quality and software development practices, but it actually makes you apply your thinking, your theory, your logic to real world problems. This is not a case of doing an onboarding module or trying to complete some kind of certification with examples or case studies. Open source is making you work on real life tasks, real problems that people are facing, and actually asking you, much like when you work for clients or do delivery work, can you solve this problem because there's a real need for it? And people are going to benefit directly as a result of that. You're being tasked, you're being tested, your perhaps capability is being stretched to solve these problems. But we all know that the more times we fail, the better we get at this. So it's great to see open source as an enabler of skills. And I know that many of our contributors really also have their own personal kind of sandboxes or repos that they use to try and test out things in the open source space, taking on board real life issues that have been raised. And then by virtue of doing that, we then come on to our third point around improving network. So it's going to be obvious, isn't it, that if we're engaging with products and solutions all over the world, then we're obviously going to be engaging and collaborating with engineers from all walks of life. And I've seen some fantastic relationships, some amazing communities be built off the back of open source solutions. And you only need to look at communities such as DrupalCon, Kubernetes, stuff that's happening in those spaces, and particularly the fun, for example, they have at the annual DrupalCon when we're in a bit more normal times, that the friendships that have been built out of that shared interest, that shared motivation to improve a piece of software. So there's a real benefit, not just in extending your personal network here, but also your professional one in terms of engaging with those collaborators and business leaders from all over the world. And that certainly allows you to build your own reputation as well and get your name out there. And then perhaps finally, if we think about what's in it for you, what are you going to get out of this? There is a real opportunity here, I believe, to improve your leadership capabilities. So many of you might be working in a development team or reporting into a delivery manager, for example, but open source enables you to perhaps take a little bit of that responsibility on board yourself. So if you start to think about how you might move towards maintaining a project, or how you might help in channeling work or prioritizing workloads, triaging issues, for example, or even prioritizing contributors or junior developers within the open source space. Open source presents a real opportunity for you to build some skills that you might never have the opportunity to do in your paid job, but this provides you an opportunity to bring that kind of leadership skills to the table and demonstrate your capabilities, but also elaborate on them. So I hope that's all clear, and I hope you kind of see why I'm so excited about this opportunity to try and get some of you more involved, or indeed your first kind of steps into open source. So the next few slides then are going to talk about how do we get started? What if it's all a bit too daunting for you? Because certainly being a new open source contributor can be just as daunting as joining a new client, a new job, or a new project. And questions obviously such as, how do you know what to contribute to? Who do you go to with questions? Do you only have to contribute code? And what if you make a massive error? These are typically the kind of things that engineers come to us with questions around. I want to get started, but I'm worried. So how do we get started? Well, let's get this one out of the way first, especially given who I'm talking to today. It's not all about coding, but I want to be really clear here. That doesn't mean that it's all about documentation. I know that people think, well, if I'm not writing code, I'm going to be writing documentation. And that's not the case. This absolutely doesn't mean it's not about engineering. The option to contribute to open source outside of code could be through engaging with necessary actions, such as tidying up issues, clarifying technical questions, really helping to define reproduction steps on defects, for example. Maybe perhaps you might want to write a little bit of documentation. It's always useful once in a while. So collaborating on kind of wikis hosted on GitHub, for example, or even searching the internet and finding good implementations or good reference architecture to bring back to the project to help future individuals kind of frame their efforts as well. I know many of you speak multiple languages, and there's a real need as we see some of these larger scale open source projects grow to translate documentation, to translate and comment the code, even start to pull together newsletters or release notes. These are all great kind of baby steps into open source that don't necessarily need a full understanding of the code base of the solution, but can provide absolutely real value to individuals who will be using this solution going forward. And then a final thing in terms of not engaging with the code just yet, perhaps you can support around community advocacy. So very similar to some of the stuff I facilitate within EPAM, but around arranging events, meetups, being the individual to bring together people to talk about the topic or the latest release, what's next on the roadmap. So yeah, it's absolutely not about code, but it can be all about code. So if this is your thing, I'm sure it is for many of you, then there are plenty of ways to get involved as an open source contributor, certainly in those early days through code. And that might simply just be about finding issues to get stuck into. And my next slide will go into that in a little bit more detail. But perhaps one of the easiest approaches here is to have a look at the features roadmap. What's next on this solutions pipeline? They've done the planning. I'm talking about the maintainers of the project. They've looked into the detail, they've planned this out, they've got the architecture, they know what's next, but they just need the hands-on kind of coding experience to get that job done. And that's a perfect candidate for someone new to open source. You've all got the capabilities in software development, but perhaps don't necessarily have the background on the solution. Well, just say, look, I'm ready, I'm here, you tell me what needs coding, and I can get stuck in. Now, it might not be perfect in the first instance, but open source is a friendly space, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. You perhaps could also get stuck into some testing. So perhaps following some defined unit tests or looking at some of the example use cases and seeing how you can perhaps try and break the software, raise some issues. And possibly even if this is an area of expertise for you, make some suggestions around tooling or automation. This is an emerging area. We're seeing more and more kind of CI/CD stuff moving over into the open source space. Or simply, and I suppose most importantly, just write some code. If there's some issues there that you think you can grab, you think you can contribute to this, then get writing, raise some pull requests and see what kind of feedback you get. And really, I believe that they're the first steps to being an open source contributor. So how might you find that first issue? Well, many of you might be aware of this, but this hashtag good first issue is a real great way to get stuck in and find issues that need to be resolved. And these won't be typos or small kind of trivial things. These will be issues, and this hashtag is used on the issues filtering GitHub, for example, and various other websites, that the maintainers of a project have said, these issues don't require an extensive experience. They might require a little bit of reading or a bit of context around the solution, but we really think that this would be a great candidate for a new contributor to get stuck in on. And of course, if they've tagged it as good first issue, then they're going to be willing to support you and guide you through that. But as with all things, it's really important, I believe, to ensure that you're reading what's perhaps come before you. So my next advice is that despite everyone being invited in open source, it really makes time to understand the community, the solution, the project that you're engaging with. So this is about making some small steps to read a little bit about the history, to know a bit about the community and the solution that you're getting stuck into. And it's not saying become an expert in this, it's just saying get a little bit of an understanding for the area that you're in, look around the history, look around what's happened so far. And a good example of this is it's never great to jump into a solution. And I'm sure you've all had this experience, perhaps with new testers and QAs coming on board who suddenly raise a defect that you perhaps were talking about 2-3 months ago. Perhaps there's a whole trail of discussion around this. And actually, it might not be a defect. It might just be something that has been considered and decided not a priority. Doing that, jumping in, as great as it might sound, is going to really frustrate the maintainers. So have a look at what's going on in the space, get some context around the solution, do a bit of pre-reading, and then go for it. But similarly as well, it also doesn't look great to run into a conversation, perhaps as a discussion thread ongoing, and start contributing about something totally unrelated. And I'm sure we've all seen this. You're reading a thread or a discussion board somewhere, and about 2 pages in, someone pops up with something totally unrelated or discussing a totally different issue. After all, first impressions really count. But what is important is open source communities are really forgiving. So on the basis of that, you'll find this file, particularly in GitHub, you'll find contributing.markdown. And this is a really easy way to get involved in a project. Now, all projects don't have this file, but it really couldn't be easier to get involved if you see this. So the file will be presented to you perhaps whenever you try and raise an issue or a pull request, or indeed you can read it in your own time. And what the contributing file outlines really are guidelines that will confirm that you're submitting well-formed pull requests, opening useful issues, and sticking to the kind of prescribed approach that the maintainers would like you to follow. Now, that's not to say that they're going to prescribe a set of rules and you must do A, B, C, D. They're just going to make some recommendations and perhaps even provide some templates around how you might make an issue submission, etc. And typically these contributing files include coding conventions, steps to follow to submit an issue, and indeed templates like I just mentioned. And if the file is there, then my strongest recommendation, particularly for those of you new to open source, is use it. I mean, they've taken some time to really invest in defining this file, the scope of this. So if it is there, then have a look at it, because it's going to give you all you need and all of the guidance in terms of getting stuck into open source. And after all, open source relies upon getting so many contributors to support the life and long-term direction of solutions. And making this engagement easier is key to that success. So that's why so many project maintainers really put so much effort into what really is a tiny file. So what if you knew all of this already? Well, the next few slides then are perhaps for those of you who've already got started into open source. So maybe you've got a few contributions under your belt, maybe you're engaged in 1 or 2 projects, but you want to perhaps expand your contribution, be that through code or other opportunities. Perhaps you've seen something going on in the industry that's really piqued your interest and you want to know more. So the next slides that follow will ultimately mean you contribute more, which is fantastic. The open source world is about contributions. It's about relying upon contributions as well as community and collaboration. Let's have a look at how we can get better at open source. Now, let's start with coding this time around. This is absolutely about coding. So for those experienced engineers amongst us who've got to grips with perhaps a project or the community, now is the time to really shine and demonstrate your coding potential and skills. And a key way to get engaged whilst improving your own engagement is through code reviews, not just pull requests. And I'm sure you see this on your project. There's lots of people that write code, but perhaps when it comes to code reviews or approvals, there's perhaps less excitement about it. So as an experienced individual working on a project, the onus really is on you to help support in code reviewing, in pushing through changes, and really providing constructive feedback back to those contributors. Additionally, and I think this is really important, particularly in the open source world, is don't be afraid to review up. So if you're perhaps seeing someone who's been engaged a little bit more, or maybe as a project maintainer, don't be afraid to provide comments or discussion around their own suggestions. To go back to those benefits at the beginning, they're too learning. They're also improving their skills. Perhaps you've seen something, a use case, for example, that they haven't quite seen, or something wrong in their code. This idea of reviewing up is something I'm really passionate about, and I think we should all be kind of in a safe space when we're developing and working together on open source solutions. So yeah, contribute and really push up your comments as well. And if you're perhaps someone, as I'm sure many of you are, who has experience in supporting and training other developers, then why not offer to mentor or guide some of those getting started contributors we just spoke about in the first section, where you identify issues, for example, or features that might be broken, or perhaps you think they could be tackled by multiple engineers. Why not provide a structured approach or a development approach that could be used, perhaps breaking down an issue to say there's quite clearly 3 areas here we could focus on, 1, 2, and 3, and I think a developer could take each of these as kind of features that they could work on. And most importantly as well, and I know many of you are doing this already, be a role model and a champion for the project in demonstrating good engineering excellence. So this is about not being lazy in your coding practices. This is about making sure you comment the code accordingly. Because if we go back to thinking about those first newcomers, those new contributors to your project, if they open a source file and the code makes no sense, they can't understand why your functions are nested here and various other things going on, they're going to walk away and you're going to lose that potential contributor. So engineering excellence in the fashion of what we're talking about today is really important. And I know you're probably thinking, well, what if I'm looking for my own good first issue? Well, I really want to share this website. Triage.com is really one of my favorites, and even I use it as a non-engineer because for those of us that are really pressed for time, which is probably the majority of us, it's a really fantastic website that asks you a few simple questions about interests and favorite languages, And then it can send you a daily email, a weekly email, even a fortnightly email of a list of issues really that are related to projects that you are either interested in, perhaps you've starred those, or just languages. So Python, Java, whatever happens to be, Go, Rust. And each day, for example, it will email you a list of issues, 20, 30, 50, whatever you prescribe, and just encourage you to click on those and have a quick read. If we think of some of those larger projects out there, and this is the reason this website was built, that perhaps have got 700 or so issues in their backlog, but only 8 or 10 maintainers. Just the idea of triaging those and providing clarifications, perhaps giving clarity around things, closing down duplicates, is a full-time job for those maintainers. So Code Triage invites you to become a contributor to these projects through purely triaging, commenting, clarifying issues, and perhaps even doing a little bit of coding as well. And it really is a surefire way, I believe, to get you engaged in more projects that are relevant to your interest, but also challenge you to think a little bit. Take 20 minutes in the morning, perhaps every Friday, or an hour on a Monday once a week to look at your Code Triage email and make some suggestions. And that's great for you, because talking about that increasing engagement and sharing that engineering know-how provides a real kind of fresh outlook for yourself in terms of something challenging to wake you up and invigorate your kind of passion for engineering, but also provide some of your expert kind of guidance and skills to people who perhaps are just starting their journeys. So, of course, now it doesn't all have to be code related. This is becoming a theme. So knowledge sharing. This is super important, particularly as someone who is contributing to open source already. So you're most certainly aware of websites like Stack Overflow, and perhaps you even use this daily yourself. So your experience, language, understanding of software and solutions can be really great in providing answers to questions that people are asking. And we are all guilty, and I'm sure there's no one in the audience that would disagree with me, that we're all guilty of asking 10 questions, but perhaps only answering one. So the open source community relies upon us shifting that. So all of those open questions, all of those clarifications, we need to be answering more of those. We need to be sharing our knowledge and our context. And it's also good for you. That idea of giving back to communities is not just helping fix other issues, but provides you with benefits such as consolidating your own knowledge or refining your technical communication skills by sharing your unique experience. And it also enables you to learn perhaps new use cases. Maybe someone's come across a defect that you'd never even thought of, you'd never even considered that in the scope of your project. So engaging in this discourse, this conversation, these discussions can have some real benefits to you and the project. And of course, enables you to discover new areas or improvements with your projects that you're supporting. So talking about projects, the next area is about looking outside of our projects. So this is about engaging with the industry, looking about the projects you're contributing to and the industries or organizations that they sit within or alongside. And these are things like industry consortia, non-profit industry organizations. And they're a fantastic way to find new projects that are exciting, but also aligned in the areas that you're interested in. And EPAM, for example, is a member of many of these organizations. So the Linux Foundation, which includes CNCF, Finos, the To-Do Group, looking at kind of open source excellence. Got Kubernetes, Eclipse Foundation, Apache Big Data, the Drupal community. There's so many of these kind of open source communities bringing together like-minded, skilled individuals and projects from similar kind of walks of life into a community that sits above the individual, below the whole open source world, and brings together this shared interest to communicate, collaborate, and really move forward some of these key projects. And the Kubernetes community, for example, is growing rapidly. I'm sure so many of us are using this on a daily basis, and the work that they're doing around building out projects is really worthwhile. So I would definitely encourage engaging with some of these organizations. But also many of these foundations and organizations run their own projects, and they're always looking for individual contributors or all those within organizations to join and support. There's nothing to say that working for EPAM, for example, doesn't mean that you can't be an individual contributor to the Linux Foundation. Yes, EPAM might be a member, but also in your own time, you might choose that you want to sit on a few of those projects and contribute to them as an individual. And more importantly as well, or equally importantly, should I say, many of these foundations will have working groups, special interest groups that are not necessarily focused entirely on engineering topics, but things like innovation, ways of working, diversity and inclusion, these non-engineering topics that still rely and are desperate for for individuals to support on. And that for me is something I'm really passionate about. If this is something that you want to explore, then do reach out to me and I can definitely make those introductions. But you'd be really surprised about the number of special interest groups and working groups within these foundations that are desperate for more engineers to get on board and help shape their future direction. So hopefully you've now got some more ideas on enhancing your open source engagement if you perhaps were contributing already. We've covered getting started. We've touched on some areas around getting better. Well, what's next? How do you get recognized? And this is really important. But unfortunately, there's a bit more work that you need to do. So the open source world is a hectic one, and you're going to have to do a little bit more work yourself. So shouting about it. This is about, in my opinion, and something that perhaps developers aren't as strong as, and I really encourage this particularly here at EPAM, this is about showing off your contributions and building your open source portfolio. So asking yourself perhaps the question, why wouldn't I want to include my open source engagement contributions on my professional profile or my social media posts? Why am I not sharing that? Well, there's no obvious answer why you wouldn't do that. We're seeing more and more recruiters, we're seeing more and more talent acquisition teams looking for people's profiles, asking for their GitHub repos so that they can have a look at their code quality, their capabilities in this space. And additionally, if you're getting really stuck into a project, this opportunity of being able to shout about your expertise through attending conferences, speaking at meetups, hosting drop-in sessions, and we're seeing a real surge in people recording video tutorials. And there's a massive environment around students getting stuck into open source and some fantastic kind of student YouTubers building coding tutorials off the back of projects they're engaged in. These are all fantastic opportunities to get your reputation out there, to build your reputation, and to start being recognized for that. Things like GitHub sponsorship, things like YouTube accreditation, etc. And there's plenty of opportunities within EPAM too, joining local developer communities like Java Switzerland, Python Russia, and speaking at events like I am today. Shouting about your open source engagement can only bring good things, awareness, recognition, and improving opportunities for you. So I really encourage this. Secondly, formalizing things. So aside from talking, I think it's really worthwhile to look for opportunities to get certified in competencies or languages you're using. So the Linux Foundation, who we've mentioned a few times today, offers a large range of certification on topics such as Kubernetes, Hyperledger, Node.js. And these certifications, I believe, go a step closer to formalizing your skills coupled with a strong contribution history that really enables you to shout out as an engaged open source engineer. And so many employers, so many clients are looking at how they can fund these certifications to make sure that the engineers working within these competencies are really at the forefront of open source engineering. And it's certainly something we'll be exploring here at EPAM, sure. And once you've done this, perhaps once you've achieved these certifications, and I'm sure we'll be passing all of them, make sure to get these listed on your profiles. Update your certifications list, include this on your GitHub profile via a badge to really show those affiliations. Because thinking about building your network at the beginning, you're going to start to see an inflow of people saying, oh, great, this person is engaged in this. Oh, wow, they've just been certified by the Linux Foundation in Hyperledger. Perhaps they're really kind of excited about what's going on in the blockchain community. It's going to be a real indicator, a real flag for people to reach out to you to start engaging further. And the next slide, and our final slide really before we wrap up, is an EPAM specific one. So I apologize for anyone not listening for EPAM. But this is a big one, and this is a real driver for us here at EPAM around our own recognition. We're talking about getting recognized for your open source engagement. Within Telescope, which is our people platform, there's something called the GitHub Informer widget, and it takes 30 seconds. It just links your GitHub profile to EPAM. It doesn't share anything else. It just says, this is GitHub profile, Chris, the employee of EPAM. And what it enables us to do is within our own open source tracking tool called EOSCI. It's a public tool, we can share that. Feel free to engage with me afterwards if you want more information. It enables us to award quarterly badges and recognition and really see some of those top contributors in the company. We've got individuals contributing over 500 push events a quarter, which is fantastic. It really helps EPAM's reputation in open source, but it also provides us the opportunity to recognize. And at this point, it's fantastic for me to be able to share with you that in the next few weeks, we'll be announcing our open source contribution bonus, which is an opportunity for us to award top contributors across the globe with a financial bonus. And there's lots more information on that to be released soon. But it really goes, if we think right back to the beginning, around demonstrating that EPAM is really committed to open source and values every single open source contribution, not just for your client work, just the fact that you're engaged in open source in a personal project, a non-profit, one of those industry foundations. So that's it. That brings us to the end. We've covered getting started, we've covered getting better, and we've covered getting recognized. There is so much more, and I'm sure many of you are sitting there thinking, would have been great to talk about this area, or actually have we thought about engaging in this topic, etc. And there's a lot more value that can be delivered through open source and relying upon excellent engineers and contributors like yourself. But talking about value, I also think there's real value in making this as interactive as possible, and I'm sure there's some questions that we would need to go through. So on that note, we'll say thank you. It's been a real privilege to talk to you today. I really hope you enjoy these sessions this afternoon. In particular, I'm really looking forward to some of them, and we'll now move into questions.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful speech, Chris, and really interesting one. And we have some questions already in our chat. So let's start to answer them by their popularity. So there is a question about it in a little bit reverse mode, that what are the disadvantages of the contributing to the open source?
The disadvantages of contributing to open source. Wow, okay. Well, I mean, I suppose if I'm thinking of an individual perspective, the disadvantage is that you've probably got thousands of pairs of eyes looking at your code quality. So there's a real motivator there to make sure that you're pushing out your best work. But that shouldn't discourage you to get involved in open source, particularly some of our more junior developers who perhaps are nervous about pushing their first commit or raising their first issue. So a disadvantage might be that you are probably going to get some feedback. Similarly, and this is probably more important, and I see a lot of kind of drop-off rates here, open source relies upon engaged maintainers. So those are the 5 to 10 people that look after a project. And I say 5 to 10 because even the world's biggest open source projects only have 5 to 10 maintainers. So there's a real risk that you might contribute something, you might raise a PR, and no one gets back to you. No one replies, no one says yes or no, no one answers that question, and we see a real disengagement. So you need to go into this knowing that there is a chance that someone might ignore this, or it might go unheard, and that shouldn't disenchant you. You should perhaps look at other opportunities, or maybe make sure you're following the guidelines. But yeah, there are disadvantages that sometimes it's not like working with a client where you get an immediate feedback.
Thank you, Chris. And another question actually is a follow-up on just we recently discussed. How to decide which project is worth to contribute to?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the easiest way to look at this is probably to look at activity. So if you've seen a project that's been dormant, i.e. there's been no pull requests or there's no issues raised for a few years, then I would just say keep scrolling, move on. It's clearly either been duplicated somewhere else or it's really died. So I wouldn't focus on that. But similarly, if you see an active project that's lots of activity going on, then start to look at perhaps things like their README file, their contributing file. Does it make sense? Does it shout out to you and say, okay, yeah, this is definitely a community that I could feel a part of? What do the discussions look like in the issues thread? Is there lots of kind of flame wars and arguments going backwards and forwards? Do people look really critical of each other's code suggestions? That's probably not the space we want to be in. But if it looks like it's good, it looks like there's nice conversations, and there's some real guidelines around what that community looks like, then I would say that's a great motivator to getting stuck in. A final point on that as well, there are going to be obvious projects that have got lots of attention. We only need to look at kind of the emergence of cloud at the moment, lots of stuff going on in the fintech space, blockchain is massive. Sometimes take a step back and say, look, this project seems to be the most hot topic at the moment. Perhaps there's a project a few levels down that might really benefit from me contributing my inputs. So if you really want to get stuck into those kind of industry leading projects, then go for it. But actually sometimes think, is there a project a few levels down that might really benefit from me and my expertise, and I can get more involved myself?
Okay, thank you, Chris.
No problem.
And there is another question from the same person.
Sure.
How to choose a good open source project, I assume, for your technical needs. So how to choose an open source solution to boost your productivity and use it in your own project.
Yeah, so this is probably about taking advantage of tools like our internal tool, EOSCI, but also some of the filters and tags that you have on things like GitLab, GitHub, to look at language usage, to look at kind of frequency of issues, various things that are going on. We've all got key skills and expertise that we have within our roles. I would say try and find a project that aligns most to that. If there's a project that GitHub, for example, has a little graph on the right-hand side, let's say your top skill is, I don't know, Rust. If it's only got 2% coding in Rust and you're a 100% Rust programmer, it's probably not for you. Try and find one that suits kind of your demand, and many of them are kind of working in Python. So Python's really popular. I know we've got thousands of Python engineers at EPAM. So you definitely find a project that sits there in terms of your technical interest. And also look for projects that are going to push you. So going back to the beginning when we talked about skills, look for ones that perhaps are using a new kind of function or a new feature perhaps that you haven't used in your own language or had the opportunity to explore on your client delivery, but maybe this open source opportunity will enable you to kind of sandbox and battle test some of that. So that could be a really exciting opportunity as well.
Thank you. And there is another quite an interesting question.
Okay.
Does GitHub Informer count only open source project or any commits to other than EPAM repositories, like your own, maybe even private repository?
Yeah, absolutely. So GitHub Informer counts every single commit, so irrespective of whether it's an open source contribution or not. What the important differentiation is in terms of our recognition and our own tool, which consumes that data from GitHub, we will only include commits to repos that have an open source license. So it doesn't have to be an EPAM repo. It also can be a personal repo. You could even create a repo, attach an Apache license, and do 1,000 commits if you wanted to win the system. But please don't say that you heard that from me today. So we're literally looking for an open source license because EPAM is so committed to celebrating our open source engagement that we're really not wanting to differentiate between client and EPAM work versus open source. This is about showing that our engineers are responsible open source citizens. So yeah, as long as there's a license, an open source license on a repo, if you've installed the Informer, we'll have visibility of that and we can recognize you accordingly.
Thank you. And there is a question we already touched a little bit, but how wide is our community of the committers in EPAM to the open source?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if you look at various metrics that we have, and I mean, across the organization, we can make generalizations on the headcount of engineers we have and knowing the rough percentage of individuals who contribute to open source. The most accurate figure is those who've installed the GitHub Informer, because that's a direct representation. And at the moment, we've got over 5,000 people who've installed that we know. But we also know that we've got tens of thousands of engineers who haven't installed it. So the more people who can install that, the better, gives us a better representation. Our open source contributor index, though, available at opensourceindex.io, shows our active community, and that's about 1,600 contributors. So these are people who are contributing to open source using their EPAM domain on GitHub and are contributing more than 10 commits a month. So if you like, they're the real kind of lifeblood of open source contribution under the EPAM name. So there's about 1,600 of them really engaged in open source. It can get quite confusing talking about all of these metrics, and there's lots of kind of analysis that we can do on this. And we will be publishing in the next few weeks a report that kind of gives an indication of the community. But if you want to explore that more, like I say, the tools are public and available. So just reach out to me, we can go through the detail.
Thank you. And as you already told us that Python is one of the most popular language in the open source project. But besides the Python, what are other technologies and programming languages are popular?
Yeah, so I mean, our EOSCI tool again in EPAM specifically gives you the exact metrics around what are the most popular. I wouldn't know them off the top of my head. At the top of the pile, though, we've obviously got Python, JavaScript, C, and all of those big names that you would expect. But what's really exciting for me is that we're able to witness trends in kind of new adoption of languages. So things like Rust and Go, which we spoke about, they are seeing a massive upward trend in terms of engineers engaging in them and contributing to them. But also perhaps that suggests that from a talent acquisition perspective, we need to be getting more developers upskilled in those because clients are going to start to get excited about that as well. So I would say at the top of the pile, definitely those languages you would expect. But what's more exciting is that middle ground around not those super niche ones, not those kind of real legacy monolith languages that are going to stay at the bottom, but the ones in the middle that are really growing in an upward trend. Those are the exciting stories. Python's always going to be at the top of the pile, I think, from my perspective.
Okay, thank you. And there is a little bit more tricky one.
Yes.
Maybe you're aware of some companies or customers' typical particular requirements to use and commit back to the open source code.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So part of what we do in the Open Source Program Office is a consultancy offering. So we do support our clients on their adoption and contribution back. So we establish frameworks, ways of working, and we provide best practice around governance, infrastructure, and various other kind of DevOps operations. So we are aware of this, and we've been supporting a number of clients on open sourcing their own solutions. What's important to call out here, though, is that many clients, and I know we didn't touch on it at the beginning around the benefits of open source, many of our clients still don't necessarily see perhaps the right business benefits, or they see too many walls or red tapes around governance, legal, IP, etc. And really, as engineers, we should be helping our clients understand that actually it's not as scary, it's not as daunting as it sounds. They're probably using open source within their development already without realizing. And if we can tell that story, if we can say, actually, well, were you aware that we're already using 20% of the code base from open source, so it makes good business sense for us to contribute back and share that, then that's half of the story done. Then we can rely upon our consultants, for example, and our kind of business-focused individuals to come into the organization and say, and now let us help you a little bit on how we can make that as more secure a framework and way of working. But if you want to pick up that conversation, please reach out, and we've got some really good collateral on how we can facilitate those conversations and just help our clients really engage with open source. It's really exciting for us.
Thank you. And there is another question about the data collection of our contribution in EPAM to the open source projects. Besides the GitHub, do we take in account other platforms such as GitLab, maybe Bitbucket, or any others?
We don't at the moment, but it's not to say that it's not on our roadmap. So it is in our backlog. We have a fairly small team. Maybe we could open source it and get some contributors involved. But yeah, we have a small team. GitHub we're working on at the moment because that's what drives our global index as well. But as the global index grows and perhaps brings in things like GitLab, then it would make perfect sense, of course, for us to be starting to pull through that and aggregate that data from an internal perspective as well. So the answer at the moment is no. But it's not to say that it isn't on the horizon. It's definitely something we've explored and discussed previously.
Thank you. And actually, let's take a step back to the requirements and policies of our customers and how we can actually engage them into the open source. From my experience, that open source currently is a mark of quality for some types of projects, especially security one. So you won't be able to sell your security product if you don't have it in the open source. Maybe you can provide more details about such expertises around quite sensitive code, which must be open source to be successful.
Yeah, that's a really interesting conversation and something we're seeing more kind of focus on in the last few years. If we talk about things like regulated industries, so the financial services, the insurance sector, you can imagine the secrecy in the kind of the 80s, 90s around their ways of working, their kind of monolith code bases, all of the stuff that was going on there. The idea of them open sourcing that was a crazy suggestion. But actually, as we move forward with things like open banking, as we start to move into the blockchain, of course, the conversation that's being had now is, why would you not open source it? Why would you not provide that transparency around security, as an example, or the way in which we're working to enable clients, consumers, other engineers, for example, to just see the inner workings of that code? You're not releasing the business data. You're not releasing kind of personal identification information or even business metrics. You're just releasing the mechanism that enables full transparency around that way of working. And I think that's been a real success story of the open banking initiative here in the UK around. We've seen some of these traditional high street banks who perhaps were a little bit behind the kind of emerging N26s, Revolut, Starlings of the world, who've said, actually, we need to wake up and we need to start really leveraging some of this technology that's been put out there and pull that into our own organizations. So whoever raised that, absolutely, really on the mark in terms of open source is almost a qualifier, a prerequisite now for an emerging kind of security regulated industry space to say transparency should be at the forefront of everything.
Thank you, Chris. Actually, we ran out of current questions.
No problem.
Please do ask your questions in the Q&A section. If you don't have right now, you can post them later, and Chris will happily answer them as soon as they will appear. And once again, Chris, thank you very much for such interesting overview of open source ideology, and I do believe it's a future of all IT industry in like nearest few decades.
So it's been a real pleasure to speak to you all today, and I'm sure many of you are as excited about this as I am. So please fill my inbox, send me a tweet, whatever it happens to be, and we can continue this conversation. It's been really great to join you all today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.